Okay, I think I have both mics on. Does that seem right? All right. Well, welcome. Thank you all for spending time with us. My name is Britton Rogers. I'm Executive Director here at Yes Tomorrow. And you are here for the kickoff to the Fall 2024 Speaker Series on Connected Communities. We are delighted to have you, and I'm really excited to hear what Kelly and Jon have to say as they share their knowledge about connecting communities. Before we get started, just a few details. The talk will run from approximately 6:30 to 7:30. We will have time for question and answer at the end. We're going to save it all till the end. If you're joining on Zoom, you can put questions in the chat, and we will get to as many as we can. If you're here in the room, if you have a question at the end, if you could please wait for Sarah to bring you the mic so that we can have your question be heard over the online presentation as well. For those of us who don't know, the bathrooms are in the lobby through a couple of doors and to the left. And then I'd also like to invite everyone to linger afterward. We're going to have a little reception and some time for mingling with the guest speakers. So we appreciate that they were willing to stick around for a few moments to do that. And we will welcome donations for that, but we also welcome donations to help make this possible. Yes Tomorrow can't do what we do without the help and generosity of our many wonderful donors of all types and resources. Anything you feel moved to contribute helps us. I want to mention one other thing. There's a Standby for Locals program. We've had it going for a while, but we've recently expanded it to all of Washington County. Yes Tomorrow offers a 50% Standby for Locals program discount for our community members to encourage neighbors to participate. And the way it works is as the start of a course draws near, spots open up to that Standby for Local program, and then it's 50% off of the tuition to do that. And so you can go to our website to find out more about that. All right, so tonight we have Kelly Stoddard-Poor and Jon Kaplan. AARP Vermont Steady Kelly Stoddard-Poor and Jon Kaplan will give a transportation seminar or talk for people interested in learning what can be done to improve local transportation options for those who can no longer drive or do not wish to drive. We will learn key concepts of healthy community design, share experiences, get tips on going car light or car free. I like those terms a lot, given how car dependent we feel in the Mad River Valley at times. And we'll dig into ideas of advocacy and action. Kelly Stoddard-Poor, the Associate State Director of AARP Vermont, joined AARP Vermont in 2013 as the Associate State Director. Kelly's background is in public policy and community organizing with a strong commitment to social justice. She leads the livable community work for AARP Vermont, establishing a vision and action steps for Vermont communities to meet the needs of its aging population. Prior to AARP, Kelly spent 8 years as the American Cancer Society, where she was the Director of Health and Advocacy Initiatives. She managed the state's cancer control program and advocacy campaigns to reduce tobacco use, increase screening rates, and enhance access to health care. She earned her undergraduate degree in anthropology at UMass Amherst, our partner in our semester program, and she completed a master's degree in sustainable development at the School for International Training in Vermont. She lives in Montpelier with her family. And then Kelly will hand it off after, I think she's going first, is that right? And then she'll hand it off to Jon Kaplan, who is an AARP volunteer and a former VTrans pedestrian and bike manager. He's a retired civil engineer who worked for 30 years in the field of bicycle and pedestrian transportation. Most of his career was with the Vermont Agency of Transportation, including 13 years as the state bicycle and pedestrian coordinator. He worked on developing standards for road design to encourage active transportation, i.e. walking and bicycling, and provided technical assistance to dozens of Vermont communities. Jon retired in April of 2023 and is now working to make his hometown of Randolph more safe and attractive for people to walk and ride bikes. He's also spending time on creative writing, playing disc golf, chess, bowling, and of course, bicycling, hiking, and travel. So I welcome both of them to Yes Tomorrow, and I will hand off this podium to Kelly.
And so Jon and I will be sort of tag teaming this presentation, and then we'll do some Q&A afterwards. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. All right. So a livable community is one in which we're thinking about some really key components that need to come together to create livability. We want to think about housing, transportation, neighborhood convenience, the importance of our environment, and then security and the opportunity for civic, social, and economic engagement within our community. I think we all sort of have our own idea what a livable community means. It's probably based upon our own lived experience, places that maybe we have traveled to that we feel inspired by. Sorry, just to pause, do I need to admit people? No. Okay, you're good? Okay, all right. Yeah, no problem. So this is how AARP defines livability. And we have developed 8 domains of livability, which is based upon the World Health Organization's domains of livability. And these are really sort of 8 core components that we have developed metrics for as well. We have a livability index if you're ever interested in checking that out. It's on our Public Policy Institute page. So you can go in, you can type in a zip code, and you can see how livable that community or neighborhood is based upon these 8 domains of livability. And then you can figure out some of the policy points in which you can improve each of those metrics. So we've got housing, we have outdoor spaces and buildings when we think about the accessibility and the programming of those buildings, transportation network, which Jon and I will be talking about today, communication, technology, and information. How easy it is to get information about your community is a key piece of like how engaged you can be in the process. And then civic participation and employment opportunities, respect and inclusion, and then health services and community support services in the community, and social participation and volunteer opportunities. So if you have all 8 of those domains, you truly have an age-friendly community. And one of the most important pieces is that this work takes a lot of time. So you've got to really be in it for the long run. So before we get started, I love this quote because I think it's so important when we think about transportation. So I'll just, instead of me reading it to you, I'll just give you a moment to read it. Can all of you want me to read it?
Something in front.
Oh, yep, I'm happy to read it. All right, all right. Do you want me to still read it? I could. Thank you. Good. I'm just gonna wait for everyone to kind of look back at me. Okay. All right. So transportation, right? It can be the opportunity and the connector in our communities, and it can also be that barrier. It can be what prevents us from getting a job. It can prevent us from going to the hospital. It can prevent us from going to see friends and family members. And then it can also be this stimulator for economic and social capital as well. So we really want to think about how our transportation network ties together our community community from a land use perspective, and from a social justice perspective as well. We don't want our transportation system to leave people behind. All right, so before we get into transportation, we're going to talk a little bit about demographics and trends that are happening, just to sort of set the stage and also the importance and the need, why we need to take action around transportation. So, no surprise here, we are an aging country, we are an aging state. I'm gonna just come over here on this side so I don't block folks. So we see here, so this is the median age at 50 plus. This is the most recent census data. And you can see the dark green sections. And this is New England right here, obviously, where we are at. And you can see how much darker this is from like a state like Utah. Utah's the youngest state in the country. And then here, where we have gone from a pyramid of aging to a pillar, right? So when we talk about the demographic shift that's happening across the country, and in northern New England, this isn't just like a blip in time. This is the longevity of what we will be experiencing, as that we are living longer, healthier lives, which is really fantastic. But also our needs change as we age, right? And that is the most important piece. And thinking about how we're planning for our future and how we're meeting the needs of older adults will be really critical to the future of our economy, of our society as a whole. No big surprise here. We are a very rural state. We are second only to Maine in how rural Vermont is, right? So we have a small population scattered across the entire state. Our biggest city being Burlington, which is still, in comparison to the rest of the country, a pretty rural city. All right, so what does that look like here in Vermont, given the demographic shift that's happening, and then also how rural our state is? So 40% of Vermonters are over the age of 50, and about 20% of our population is over the age of 65. For the first time ever, by 2034, the United States will be made up of more households of those over the age of 65 than those under the age of 18. So it sort of goes back to that pillar, right? Like, this is what our future is looking like. We are going to be an older country. 24% of Vermonters who are driving are 65 and older, and 6% of Vermonters who are driving on the road are 80 and older. So one of the problems is, like, when we look around our communities, too many of our communities, not just in Vermont, but across the country, have been designed specifically for automobile travel. We see sometimes a sidewalk, and maybe it isn't very well maintained. We have a crossing here, but no crosswalk. Very, very narrow sidewalk if we're pushing a stroller, we're in a wheelchair, or pushing a walker. No curb cuts here either if we're using any type of wheeling device. So how we get around in our communities can really be a barrier if we want to cut back on our driving, or if we can't drive at all. And so also another U.S. Census data point, 8% of households do not own or have access to a motor vehicle. And then if we include kids in that picture, that percentage will go up even more. So every 3 years, AARP Vermont, we put out a survey into the field. That's a very Vermont-specific survey, asking 45 plus what they think about their community, what they're thinking about pocketbook issues. These set of questions were focused on independent living, right? We want to be able to stay independent as we get older. And one of the biggest increases that we had from the last time we fielded this survey in 2022 from 2019 was this really big increase into this concern around getting to the places we need to go independently, right? So, like, as we're aging, we're thinking about, okay, so if I have to cut back on my driving, or I don't want to drive at night, I don't want to drive in the snow, how am I going to be able to get around? Or if I have to hang up the keys to my car, how am I going to get around in my community? And those are really important questions that we will all be asking ourselves. So how does our built environment impact us as we are aging? So these are sort of the negative pieces, right? And we'll also be talking about how transportation can also be that opportunity. And so if we are not able to get to the places we need to go by using a vehicle, automobile, or walking or biking or using public transit, social isolation really increases. We all experienced what social isolation feels like during COVID, and it was not something that I think anybody wants to go back to. But the risk for social isolation increases drastically if we're not able to have mobility outside of our home. One of our other surveys that we asked people how often you get out of your house, per week, and think about for yourself, like how many times you leave your own home per day or per week, and about 10% of folks were only leaving their house once a week. So imagine how small your world becomes when you're not able to get out and have connections with your community, with your family members. It takes a huge toll on your health and your mental health. It's actually, social isolation is compared to smoking about a pack of cigarettes a day. So we know the impacts of tobacco. Josh is like, what? Yeah, it's a huge impact on our health if we are socially isolated. And then a number of other issues arise as well when we're not thinking about the connections and transportation network in our community. So how dependent are we all on our cars? So I would just be really interested to find out here, like for folks, like do you feel that you take the majority of your trips by vehicle? Yep, guilty. Yeah, and maybe thinking, I would like for some of you to start thinking about like, why aren't you able to walk or bike or take public transit? Often it's a safety issue, right? Like walking feels unsafe. There's a lack of connection for sidewalks. Maybe there's not a bus stop near where you live. It's more than 2 miles away. So start thinking about some of the reasons of why you're not able to walk, bike, or use public transit. All right, so Vermont's travel modes, this is what the state looks like. So the majority of us are getting around by using a car and a small, but this chunk here, I mean, it is a pretty sizable amount, 10% of trips happening by walking, and then about 1% by biking, and then public transit at 0.3% here. And I think with biking as well, there's such opportunity when it comes to electric bikes. It can extend our biking years. It can allow us to bike further, and also kind of deal with some of the tough terrain as well. All right, so annual per capita vehicle miles traveled. So Vermont is right here, and then other rural states across the country, and then our national average. So we are driving more and further than our peer states. And so I think that there is such opportunity to be able to shift that. And this is the most promising slide. So thank you to Jon, because he pulled this one out. And I really love it because these are the trips that we're taking in Vermont under 2 miles, right? So I see this as the opportunity. What are ways that we can shift the mode here for people who are still driving to make a trip under 2 miles? How can we make opportunities so that it makes it easier for people to take this trip that is less than a mile by walking or biking? And then here, we're going to talk about microtransit. So microtransit trips within 2 miles, and then some of those longer trips, whether we're carpooling or thinking about connections with the bus. So this slide, I hope, leaves you with a little bit of hope where we could shift those modes into walking and biking. All right, so what changes in the built environment do we want and need if we are no longer able or want to drive? And so one thing I think is really important for folks to know is that all of us here in this room are going to outlive our driving years. It's estimated that as women, we're going to outlive our driving years by 10. As men, you'll be outliving your driving years by 7. So thinking about how we're going to get around in our community and stay connected is really important. The majority of people want to be able to age in their community. That means staying in their home or staying in their community as long as possible. And so if we want to stay where we are, we want to make sure that we have mobility options to get around. All right, so now I'm going to turn it over to Jon, and he's going to talk about walkability and street design, and then I will be back. And then there's this one here too. Okay. Great, thank you.
Hopefully that's all right. Yeah, thank you, Kelly, for that. I think all of that context is really important, because just to have the sort of the background of how we got to where we are and kind of some of the demographics that drive things. So this is probably, not a big surprise, but, if we build a transportation system that is very car-focused, we're going to get more driving. And that's unfortunately sort of the direction that the U.S. headed for a long period of time. This is just an example of one of the things that's a big factor. We provide a lot of free parking, for example. And there's a whole sort of theory or notion of induced demand. So like, for example, if there's a road that is starting to get congested, traditionally the sort of engineering improvement has been, well, we need to add a lane to this road, it's congested. And basically what we've found over time is that when we do that, you actually induce even more driving, and that same road, even if you added a lane, will become congested again. So kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. And so, to sort of shift away from that, it's really about focusing on all the different ways that people can get around, and especially around, walking and biking for those shorter trips, like 2 miles or less. Or you saw on that one slide, it's like 30% of trips in Vermont are a mile or less, which is a very, that's probably, I would say that's sort of the outer limit of like a reasonable walking trip, but, half a mile for walking is very reasonable, and, 2 miles or less for biking, I would say, and especially with e-bikes. So there's a lot of images in here around walking and biking and different things that communities have tried, and I'm not going to get into a lot of the engineering details. Those are certainly all out there. And I've got one resource I'm going to mention, which is one of the things that I noticed sort of towards the end of my career was how much like the Federal Highway Administration had shifted to provide a lot more design guidance for walking and biking, which was very encouraging, because for a long time that was not the case. And so there's one guide, if there's one that you would take away from this, if you just Google FHWA STAR guide, and Alice, I'm trying to see if I can remember what that stands for. It's like Small Town and Rural Transportation Networks or something like that. And it's really, in fact, there's some case studies in there from Vermont, but that is a great guide from the Federal Highway Administration that has, specific things that communities can implement on the types of roads that we have in Vermont. So these are some images of just different ways to design streets. Don't take the colors as, the exact design treatment, but, doing things like providing space for bikes that's protected from traffic. That is definitely the direction that biking facilities is headed, is sort of separated bikeways to address kind of some safety concerns and really make you feel comfortable riding next to traffic. So one thing to do when you're sort of like getting to the real like community level and trying to assess conditions is to do what's called a walk audit, and AARP actually has a really good guide for walk audits. This is a great way to like get local officials, community members, you know, other kind of interested parties in your community kind of familiar with what the actual existing conditions are for walking. Actually, I was very happy to see these pictures in here. I took all these pictures. These are all in Randolph, but you know, typically you will see, and it's not just to focus on the negative. I think that's one important thing, because you will find positive things, but you probably will find more negative. But you know, this is just like a street with, yes, there's a shoulder, but not really any dedicated place for walking. This is a mom and her child walking down a street, or well, she has the child in the stroller. Again, no sidewalk. And then, of course, there's like the importance of winter maintenance. This actually is a sidewalk. This is right near where I live, and this is a street kind of coming up out of our downtown. And you know, granted, Vermont is a little harsh on, you know, maintaining facilities in the winter, but in this case, the sidewalk was like so treacherous that the person just didn't feel safe, and actually they wouldn't have been safe walking on the sidewalk, so just something else to consider. But the walk audit is a great way to, you know, you're not going to do like a whole sidewalk inventory, for example, but it's a good way to start to have that conversation and get people to start to look at the streets with a different set of eyes. That's really the important part of it. And, you know, we did one of these in Randolph, and we got the local paper to come, take pictures, do an article, so it just kind of helped raise the public awareness about what we were doing. So another thing is demonstration projects. This is something that kind of is a new, kind of relatively new kind of tool in the toolbox. The idea is to, you know, if there's some envisioned change to a street, rather than, you know, go out there with the heavy equipment and dig things up and pour concrete, do something with temporary materials initially, just so that people can actually see what the changes look like on the ground. They, you know, first of all, like the local government will be more willing to let you try something that's just temporary. Let's say it's there for a few days or even just one day. And it also gives you a chance to like modify a design. So you can put something out with cones even, and then, you know, let's say a truck can't make a turn because you've tightened the corner up a little bit. You know, you move the cones, and you're kind of doing design on the fly in a way. So there's a real value to doing those, and they can be really fun as well. This is just a few examples of some demonstration projects. Was this in Bethel? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So they did this temporary bike lane. I think this was just like those hay, what do you call them?
They were like straw walls.
Yeah, there we go. Yeah. That are, yeah, those are usually used for erosion control, I think. But they did these temporary parklets just with pallets that were joined together, you know, sort of take up a parking space to create more public space. And then they used, again, the hay and just some flowers and baskets to do like a bulb out at this crosswalk, just to show what that would be like. And this project, I know I was somewhat involved in this project, and it was very successful. Oh, and they also did like these markings right in front of the crosswalk, extra markings to kind of draw attention to the crosswalk.
And Lindley built the parklet.
So another aspect of different ways to get around is public transit. And, you know, there's a real connection between walking, biking, and public transit. Because if you think about it, even if you're like the most diehard like car driver, if you do end up using public transit, you know, you're going to start or end that trip as a pedestrian. You're going to get off the bus and walk somewhere. So how the transit connects to a walking network is another important thing. And there's sort of this concept of transit-oriented development, which is, providing development in places that's served by transit already, or within walking distance. And so that has something that's, kind of a planning concept that is, sort of has taken off. And that could be in a downtown, or it could be in neighborhoods, that different type of thing. I forget if there's a slide about this, but I do want to mention, so we're talking about primarily transportation, but there is a real land use aspect to this. And, I think there is some guidance and direction from the state now that encourages higher density in our developed downtowns, and all of that supports walking and biking, because then you have all the mix of uses, where people live, jobs, services that are all within a dense area, and that allows for walking and biking. So microtransit is really more not only the size of the vehicle, but it also has to do with kind of more on-demand type of public transit. I'm not a public transit expert, but I know that the state has been experimenting with this in the last few years. And this is just a picture of, this is in downtown Montpelier. This is the new transit center right in the downtown. Also has, I believe it has housing above where the transit center is, and good connections to the bike path in Montpelier and the sidewalk network. So micromobility is just kind of the idea of expanding from sort of traditional bikes to all the various sort of personal mobility devices like scooters, e-bikes, all the different sort of things that you see out there now that people use. So generally, a lot of these kind of function as bikes, and some are kind of hard to classify. I know issues come up about should scooters be on the sidewalk, or do they go in the street, and that kind of thing. Right, I think it's going back to you.
Thanks, John. Thank you for being patient with the mic transfer. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. All right, we're only doing that one more time, and then we'll be good. All right, so public spaces and parks. All right, so I think it's really important when we think about mobility, we want to think about destinations in our community. And we want to start, as John had shared, we want to start about the assets. What do you love about your community? What are the things when you walk around your neighborhood or your town that you love and that you want to see replicated? And those are the pieces that you want to build from. We want to start from an asset base, right? So connecting the different assets in your community, whether that's a community center, a senior center, a transit center, churches, cafes, right? So we all have something that we love about our community, and we want to find those pieces to be able to shine. The image down here in this corner is in Brattleboro, and this is their transit center right here. Are folks familiar with Brattleboro at all? Okay, it's in the southern part of the state. The population's probably about 10,000. And this was a really kind of scary alleyway, and you wouldn't necessarily feel safe walking through it. It was overgrown. It just was kind of gross. And so they received, their downtown organization received a small micro grant from AARP, and they used that grant to be able to create some wayfinding signs so that people knew where to catch the bus, that there was parking available, and then they cleaned up this alleyway, and they sort of activated it. They provided some lighting, some public art, some seating, and it felt completely different, and they did it all for about $3,000. So thinking about those places, right, so they had this wonderful transit center that people weren't necessarily utilizing very well because this alleyway did not feel all that safe connecting through it. So thinking about ways that you can improve that connection in your community is really important. All right. Volunteers and programming. So really relying on volunteers. In Vermont, we have, I think volunteers do most of the work in our municipalities. And it's pretty amazing. And so finding volunteers to be able to get programming off and going is a really great way to get people excited about walking and biking. Getting walking groups started, getting biking groups started. So this is Linda is our volunteer state president. She lives in Burlington. She's an avid cyclist, and she started this monthly bike ride for older adults in Burlington, getting people out on their bikes who hadn't been biking for some people it had been decades since they had touched their bike. And now they go out on these monthly rides from May through October. And it provides this wonderful social connection, and now all of these people are biking that hadn't been biking before. So there's about 25 people that go out on these monthly bike rides. So a program that we would love to expand outside of Burlington. So if anybody is interested in starting a monthly bike ride in your neighborhood, let me know. All right, and then intergenerational programming. So thinking about public spaces and making sure that we program those public spaces is also really important when we think about those destinations that we want to be able to take walking and biking. As John was talking about transit-oriented development, we want to make sure that that assets and development are within like a half a mile to a mile. That's where people are going to be able to walk to. And a little bit more than a mile, people are going to want to prefer to go biking instead. But a lot of times we create great public spaces and then we don't program the spaces at all, and it remains empty. And so really finding some low sort of barrier ways to get in and program spaces is really important. And ask community members what they want in their public spaces, whether it's their community centers or their parks. There's so many fun ways that you can activate those spaces. All right, where is winter? Well, it's around the corner, even though it doesn't feel like it today. And so for just a show of hands, how many people here live in Vermont? Okay, so a decent amount. Okay, great. And then how many people live, if you don't live in Vermont, are you from a cold climate state? Okay. All right, a little bit, yeah. So winter here is long, and a lot of times we think about our public spaces only for like 3 to 4 months, right? We design them for just for those beautiful July days. So we really want to think about how we're maintaining our street and our sidewalk network throughout the winter months. And for people that are living in, let's say, hotter climates, you want to think about shade, right? Like thinking about how you can make sure that people feel comfortable in all types of climates when they're walking and biking, and making it much more enjoyable for people to go out. So whether or not that's creating space so that the wind doesn't, feel completely awful when you're biking or walking, or creating some street trees for shade if it's really hot, etc. So you really want to be able to think about the climate. Whoops, hold on one second. This is just, thinking about winter placemaking. So this has been something that came out of COVID for AARP, was that we really wanted to think about how people are using public spaces. And during COVID, we saw sort of a boom of people getting out, walking, biking, and doing things outdoors. And so being really intentional about bringing some important elements to public spaces, lighting, lighting is a really key piece. It's dark in the winter, and heat, right? It gets cold, and make something fun for people to do. This picture here is a neighborhood in Burlington, and we have this really wonderful group of active volunteers. And they do this winter placemaking event where they just completely activate a local park that was underutilized through the winter months. So they have food, hot chocolate, winter activities like sledding and snowshoeing. And as a result, the Parks Department started plowing and maintaining the network that you're able to use to get to the park now as a result, because the park became activated. Before, the snow was not being removed through the paths there, and now it is. All right, just some more images. I love the winter, and I think it's a really important piece of making sure that we embrace those long winter months. Winter can also be a trigger for social isolation as well, and so the risk for social isolation during the long winter months is really high, and we want to make sure that we're staying connected and we find ways that get people out during the winter months. All right, this is the last handoff. Oh no, one more after this, I think, right? Yeah, so this is gonna go back to Jon to talk about public policy.
I get the really fun ones.
Yeah. There we go. There's that one right there.
All right, hopefully that's okay. Yeah, so we haven't really talked much about, how do you get this done? Changing streets is, it's a process. There's really no other way to say it. And my whole time working for the state and working with a lot of different communities, I got to kind of see some of the challenges that they came up against. Even while we were there with financial resources, technical resources, trying to help them along the way. Now, like I think Kelly mentioned, we have a local walk-bike group in Randolph, which is just basically like a citizen advocacy group. And so I'm getting to see things from kind of the other side of the coin and trying to work with our local government. And so just a few kind of key things I would say. A lot of the work, I would say, really kind of, it does get down into the weeds a little bit of town government and how town government functions. For example, it took me a little while to really dive into like our town's budget and understand how they were funding just sidewalk maintenance in our town and where was that money in the town budget. Sometimes that is not crystal clear, so you really have to kind of dig, ask a lot of questions. So this is kind of a little bit of a hierarchy. Certainly the town plan should ideally say something about walking, biking. There's probably some language in there about kind of quality of life. And, but the town plan is a good start. You need that kind of foundation. But if then you don't have some of the other kind of regulatory pieces in place to actually implement the town plan, things can kind of fall apart. For example, if you don't have zoning that encourages density, if you don't have money in your budget to repair or build sidewalks, or street standards that talk about like lane widths. Like often road lane widths are way wider than they really need to be. And that is just kind of a holdover from like old engineering standards from like when the interstate was getting built. And I can, that is something that I saw through the length of my career, like change. But some of that old thinking is still out there, so you have to kind of push back against that. And there's, a lot of like highway standards that towns go by and some engineers will go by, and there's actually a lot of flexibility in those standards, and it takes a little bit of nuance to kind of know how to, how do you kind of push back against that, so that there is room for a bike lane or for a sidewalk. And I think using some of that like demographic information and pointing out that, our streets are for the public, they're public streets, they're not streets for drivers, even though sometimes that's the perception. They're streets for everybody, regardless of how you get around. And if, I think I remember a statistic, I think it's as high as like 20 or 25% of Vermonters don't drive when you count all ages. So, everyone under 16 or 15, and then some older drivers who don't want to drive anymore or can't because of some physical disability. So we really need to design our streets to work for everybody. That's a point that I constantly used. So yeah, and I don't know how many people have heard the term complete streets. I'm just kind of curious. So just a few. So complete streets it's really all about just what it sounds like. It's building streets that work for all different modes of transportation. And Vermont does have a complete streets law, which applies both to municipalities and to the state. So if you have like a state project coming through your community, the state is supposed to be complying with, putting in a road that works for everybody, and towns are supposed to be doing that as well. And I think we just have a few images of, and one sort of key thing I would say with complete streets is there is no sort of one size fits all like complete street that will work in every community. It's kind of a concept, and it's going to be, site specific. But just some examples, here's a street that has it's narrowed at the intersection, so that has an effect on traffic speed, lower speed, better safety for everybody. And shorter crosswalks because of these bump outs. Those also give an opportunity to do something like, this is probably intended to be like a rain garden for stormwater treatment. And then things like curb ramps, so people who have to use a mobility device can access the sidewalk, space for bikes, and you can see how sort of tight this all is. That is going to reinforce a slower speed, which you want to have in like a downtown type of environment. And that's just kind of another view of something very similar. And I don't know how many of you have been to Montreal lately, but Montreal is doing like a super job with their bike network. It's really amazing. I had been up there like maybe 10 years ago, and then I went back like 5 years ago, and the difference was incredible. I mean, they've really put a lot of effort into making the streets more bike friendly with separated bike lanes, and it feels very safe to bike up in Montreal now.
They plow their bike lanes.
And they plow yes. At an expense, at quite an expense,
Yep.
but they do. All right, and then Kelly has some resources and activities to sort of support all of this.
All right, this is the home run here. All right. Thank you. Okay. All right, so just want to share a little bit about some resources that are available through AARP. As I had shared before, we have our livability index that's online, so you can go and check out your community, see how livable it is. It's a score of 1 through 100. And then you can pull down on what's driving that score based upon maybe poor neighborhood convenience, or maybe it's transportation, et cetera. And yeah, did you see I have Lindley in there? Yep. That was from one of our placemaking workshops. So we host hands-on placemaking workshops. We offer a number of different types of grants. In Vermont specifically, we have our winter placemaking grants, and then our national office, through our livable community work, we have our community challenge grants. Those will come out in January. They'll close the first week of March. So those grants average around $11,000. And those are available across the country. And those are really a great resource for funding a community project and getting something off the ground. And then we also have technical assistance as well. So thinking about work within the transportation or housing or placemaking worlds, reach out to your local AARP office if you're interested in pursuing something like that for your community. And then some of the resources that I brought, so I have some paper copies back there. We've got, let's see here. This is the DIY cookbook. So this is like community projects that you could do in your community. So we start with some very low, sort of easy recipes to more challenging recipes, up to parklets and things like that. So I have lots of copies of this. This tends to be really popular, things that you could do in your own community to enhance livability. And then I love doing walk audits. I've been really busy this past month doing a lot of walk audits. John joined me. We went up to Lunenburg and Gilman, which is up in the Northeast Kingdom, for the day. Populations like around 1,000 in each of those communities. And it's a really great way to assess what sort of assets you have in your community, what sort of network already exists, and then what are ways that you can improve the walkability. On the back of the walk audit, there's some worksheets that you can download on our Livable Community website. And so if you are interested in, thinking about crossing, want to improve crosswalks, there's a worksheet there specifically, so it helps you ask important questions and go about doing an audit. We also have a park audit as well, so thinking about activating those public spaces and outdoor recreation. This is also a wonderful tool. And then we have our community garden one as well. So if you're interested in starting community gardens in your town, this is a great way to get going on that. And then from a land use perspective, housing is so important. So thinking about housing that is not single-family housing. So things like accessory dwelling units in the backyard or attached to the main house, duplexes, triplexes, cottage court styles. This is all about changing zoning. And this is also a wonderful tool, and there's some great tools from the Vermont Department of Housing and Community Development too in that space. So, all right, would wrap it up. Yeah. And if folks want to take any of these, they're back here. I'll leave them. Oh, shoot. I did so well up until then. So I think John and I are happy to take questions.
Are there any questions here in the room or?
Yeah, a reminder to let you get to your question.
Okay.
I was just going to make one quick comment because I'm looking right at Josh. And as far as like resources that are out there to help communities, I know the Mad River has kind of a different model with the planning district, right? So you do kind of planning for multiple communities, but there's also the regional planning commissions in the state, which is a really good resource to help communities. They know all about like all the different funding that VTrans and other state agencies have to support this kind of work, as well as technical assistance. So,
I was just wondering if other like cities or states are doing what I know is happening in Baltimore right now around e-bikes. They're doing a lottery system to like help people buy them, or they're even giving some out.
Yep.
Is that like a common thing that's happening throughout the
It
country?
is. So providing incentives for e-bike purchases is a great way to get people to be able to buy one, because they're expensive, right? So Vermont, sadly, we've only allocated about $70,000 to our incentive program for e-bikes, and it's been primarily focused on lower to moderate income households. And it is at the point of sale, which is a great place if you are going to have a rebate, you want it then versus, applying for it afterwards. Yeah, there's a lot of great information, and that's certainly something that is taking off. I have some really great information that was done for us from a consultant to look at some best practices from over in Europe and then in Canada, some sort of model programs around e-bike incentives. If you'd like that, I'd be happy to email it to you.
Yeah.
I have a question. Thanks. Thank you both very much. I noticed you had so you talked about the walk audit and there was another park audit.
Park audit.
Do you have a bike audit?
We do have a bike audit.
do?
I don't have any printed because they just were released in the last few months. So
Great.
Yeah.
I'm so glad, because I'm
Yeah.
thinking about a project. There was just a big repaving project here in the valley, and there's absolutely no attempt to cater to anything other than a big truck.
Yeah.
And I would love to give them some evidence of other things that could be done there.
yeah. So if you don't mind me asking, is it a state highway?
No, it's a town road.
It is a town road. Okay. Do you want to talk about that at all?
I know
Yeah.
the project,
Okay.
but I do not know the circumstances on how they ended up doing what they did.
Okay. All right. Yeah. So we.
Josh, you and I can talk.
Do you want to? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's not like there isn't a lack of resources or suggestions or ideas and batted around, but
Right.
yeah, having those ideas and the implementation on the same page is.
I would just say, like, that is one of those, like, nuts and bolts things where you have to be kind of ahead of the game in terms of knowing what's the town planning for upcoming paving. Are there road standards? Many towns, I would guess, don't have any they sort of default to, like, national standards.
Yeah.
But there's nothing that prevents them from having their own standards, within, there's certainly, like, you're not going to have like a 6-foot travel lane, which a vehicle can't fit in, but, and basically in Vermont, like, it's kind of simple on road jurisdiction. It's either the town or the state, If it's not a state highway, it's under the town's jurisdiction, and they have all the control over the lane widths, whether they stripe the shoulders, whether they put on bike lane symbols, what kind of signs, where crosswalks go. And so, depending on the sort of, staff capacity at the town, there's a lot of towns that are just a select board and then it's a road foreman. And so it can be a challenge to get those guys or gals who are road foremen to understand that their need goes, or their customers are more than just people that are driving. And I know that's something that, I have not made a personal connection with our road foreman in Randolph yet. And I think basically he thinks our group is just a pain in his ass, so, which we are.
Yeah, and so for projects happening in Vermont, VTrans does have a Complete Streets website that you can go up. It's been recently updated. It's in a really good place where you can go in and look at the project, find why Complete Streets was not fulfilled, like why all users were not addressed with the repaving project, and then you'll have a better understanding of also why that occurred.
If it's a state project, right?
No, if it's also a town,
Or state funded, probably.
they should have them all,
Oh,
but
maybe
we'll
they're
see.
very long.
We'll see. I mean, it's challenging, I think, also from VTrans's perspective to get all of those reports up, right? But I will send that out, the link. Yep.
So approximately, so yes, I'm Josh Schwartz with the Mad River Valley Planning District, our Waitsfield, Warren, and Faison three-town planning entity, and we've done a lot of work in the realm of transportation over the duration of our existence, just almost 40 years now. But we did an active transportation plan about 8 to 10 years ago that envisioned, which actually started in the way that you mentioned. It started with what are the things we're trying to connect, right? What are the nodes of interest, and then what are the ways to enhance those connections to move around under human power. So often, folks are looking at trails as the way, or off-road, these sort of minor or major off-road connections, but the vast majority of our connections are existing on-road. And so through that plan, which included surveying and lots of recommendations and suggestions, there were a lot related to essentially our rural roads and the ways in which we can make it feel safer to move around by walking or biking. The vast majority of the recommendations were really in what I would categorize as education. It's signage.
Yep.
So many roads are dirt, so there are limited options. But are there other recommendations for? So one, I was curious if you had any other recommendations beyond signage and those minor rural roads. But Britton makes a point: the sort of disconnect between an analysis and recommendations to policy and implementation, which is truly because we have mostly run by volunteers and small staff doing the implementation. But that's where we need to put more effort. So other recommendations for rural connection, like rural roads and increasing confidence and safety
For people who want to walk and bike. I mean, one of the things is getting walking groups going, right? People, like, there's safety in numbers, and so if you're able to get people out, taking part in exercise and walking and biking together, that definitely will help. I think the signage piece is important. Any type of, I don't know the stretch. Are you thinking, is it a rural route?
Yeah.
So there's nothing sort of along the route itself, right? And just, I think, finding space with the shoulder, if you're able to narrow the width of the lane and create more of a shoulder with some striping, that would be helpful. Yeah, John might have some.
Yeah, I think, I don't know, I think like unpaved roads, that is a challenge in terms of what you can do. I always felt like the way more difficult part of my job when I was working for the state was anything that had to do with behavior, changing behavior, as opposed to, you can engineer something, you can build it, given enough funding and political will and so forth, but, driving behavior, that is a real challenge, and getting people to, and I don't think it's just putting up, share the road sign every 100 feet.
Yeah.
That doesn't really do it either, and then it becomes kind of like, as one of my coworkers used to call it, litter on a stick. Just like a lot of signs out there that are kind of, making the environment not look great either. Mm-hmm. And that's another thing for towns to have to maintain. So that is a real challenge. I know, kind of going along with what Kelly just said, with walking groups or bike groups, some towns, have like sort of mapped routes that are more commonly used, and then that becomes a little bit more publicly known, like, hey, if you're driving on whatever road, you should expect to see bicyclists, and slow down, and here's why. And the education thing is like, you gotta just like say it and then say it again, and it's gotta be out there all the time and different formats, but.
Is it a paved road or is it a dirt road?
I was thinking of both.
Both, yeah, okay. Yeah, just recently I was just across the border in Canada on a very rural stretch of road. It was paved, and there was no sidewalk or anything, but they had a really decent shoulder, and they had bollards like maybe every 50 feet. It wasn't super tight and frequent, but it was just enough to keep cars to go slow. Because that's the big piece, right, is that cars are speeding and it feels really unsafe to be walking on the side of the road when someone's traveling 50 plus miles an hour next to you. So I thought that that was kind of an exciting piece for, like, you know, rural traffic calming. Yeah.
So I'm a cyclist, and Montpelier downtown is trying to do some really good things down there, but you always have situations where now they're putting sharrows in the road. That term means nothing to 90% of the people who drive cars. I get honked at, I get sworn at, because how do we get that information out there? And I keep thinking to myself, hopefully it's coming through driver's ed, and that we're waiting for the next few generations to
Yeah.
sort of catch up. I don't know.
I know.
Yeah, I mean, so, yeah, I don't know if everyone knows what the sharrow is. So those are the bike symbols that are kind of out in the center of the lane. They're supposed to be used as, I always consider them as being used for kind of a short connection where you just didn't have space to do an actual bike lane. I honestly was never a big fan of sharrows because of just the issues that you mentioned. Not very well understood by drivers or cyclists, really. And honestly, you know, they offer zero protection for the bicyclists. So, you know, they're kind of like just more than doing nothing and kind of questionable. They haven't been around that long as a design treatment, so I don't know if anyone's ever researched. Probably someone has, you know, sort of a safety impact of them, but, you know, really it's pushing for maybe there's some alternate street, you know, that, which again, that has its downsides because then you're not serving the destinations on the street where everyone else is able to access, so.
You have to go up a big hill.
Right.
Yeah.
And I will tell you, like, if you want, what are the three things? Well, one of the three things that is a very difficult community conversation is if you talk about removing on-street parking. I went to a presentation in Montpelier, I don't know, 5-7 years ago, and a local group had a great visual that they brought to City Council, and it was a map of the downtown, and they had highlighted in red how much of the downtown was dedicated to surface parking.
Yeah.
And they made the point that, you know, is this really the best use of prime real estate in the capital of Vermont to have cars just sit there all day? Or is there better use of that public space? And that's kind of the, you know, that's the beginning of that conversation. And because, you know, you get rid of on-street parking on one side of the street, that's like a bike lane on both sides.
Yeah.
So that's a
Yeah.
very tough battle, I will tell you. I'm not going to sugarcoat that.
And they're doing that, they're doing the temporary thing that you talked about on Berry Street.
Oh.
Taken away a whole, probably 14 lanes and done it temporarily.
Yeah. I know the last visit I went to Montreal with Local Motion, which is the statewide bike pedestrian organization, headquartered in Burlington. They did sort of a tour up there in Montreal with city officials and state officials and so forth. And we met with city officials in Montreal, and, you know, at some point, you know, they had really gone in on making the streets better for bikes. And then it became kind of a positive feedback loop. More people were biking, so more citizens were advocating to the city. You know, once more were biking, they wanted more facilities. And it got to the point where this one city councilor said, now when we want to go add a bike lane to a street, we don't go through like months of public input on whether we're going to remove parking. We just do it.
Yeah.
And I mean, that takes a long time, and it takes kind of a constant, you know, you have to have those things in place, right? Like the funding, the city has to be supportive of it, the sort of the government has to be supportive of it, and you have to have the advocates pushing for it. You know, when all those things work together, progress gets made.
Yeah.
So.
Great.
Just to follow up on that, I was going to ask about that same bike lane on Berry Street. in part because I think it's interesting that like a lot of the arguments against it are for people who have limited mobility and are older and need to park closer to the things that they can maybe only access by car at this point in time. The other issue is that like Montpelier is heavily reliant on tourism. Most of those people are coming by car, or a lot of them are coming by car. So like, how do you prioritize all of those things at once and navigate that sort of like community conflict of interest that is sort of inherent in that?
Yeah, I think one, working with the business community is really key when talking about parking, because that's going to be the knee-jerk reaction around removing any type of parking, is that you're going to hurt businesses. So working with the business community is key, and you will find allies because people buy things, not cars, right? And so thinking about, and then having some type of parking assessment done. So Burlington went through that, right? Like, and they found that there was so much parking that was completely underutilized at prime times during the day. So you need to sort of like have the data and have the facts so that you can make that case around what parking could be eliminated, and making sure that you've got the signs to direct people to where there is parking that's available. But it takes, to John's point, like you've got to put those like pieces in place over time. And I mean, Berry Street is a long time in the coming, like to be able to, I mean, there's like a recreation center, there's the senior center, church, right? There's so many places that people need to be able to walk and bike, and then the bike, and then the multi-use lane is, just over on the other side there. So, and then getting that into the town plan as well, so that you can point back to what the goals are of the community. So, yeah.
So, Mac Rude here. I'm on the board of the Mad River Path Association.
Oh, yeah.
Really appreciate your focus on all these issues. As you probably know, we're in the middle of a scoping study, hoping to create an active transportation corridor from Warren Village to Route 2, a 17-mile corridor. And as you mentioned, getting the community involved and is obviously super important. We're only beginning to do that. If there's anybody here who would like to participate in that, contact us, and I'm sure we could use the help. There will be, I think there's a public meeting coming up. It's on the 13th, isn't it? It's right here.
I have a flyer right here.
There's a flyer right there. Okay.
Yeah, 5 p.m. on the 13th of November. I'm going to leave this.
Okay. So, this is all pretty exciting, and we're glad to have your help in getting the message out there.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk afterwards about how we could help get that out to our members, and the best way to do that. So I don't know what our member count is for the Mad River Valley, but we've got roughly about 120,000 members across the state. So yeah, it's a great network, and communicating to them about important things like an active transportation plan is really important. So, yeah.
When's Misha? Misha's speaking as part of this speaker series.
Misha's presenting on that corridor next week.
That's next
And then the meeting that we were talking about, not to be confusing, will be right before our speaker series on electric vehicles. So,
Cool. Who's coming for the electric vehicles?
Dave Roberts,
Okay.
he's a managing consultant at VIC.
Oh, at VIC, okay. I was just thinking if it was somebody from VTrans, then they would be able to provide information about the specifics too, about the e-bike program, because we need to make sure the legislature funds that again next year, so.
We will have Ross McDonald from VTrans.
Oh, good.
The
Ross
following
will be
week.
here. Great, terrific. I don't know if I turned this off or not.
Any other questions?
Okay.
Jan?
Another thing about e-bikes, I convert existing bikes to e-bikes, and there's no benefit for the people. They'll only do it if you purchase a brand new e-bike.
Yeah.
So we're missing a whole group of people that can't afford to buy a $2,000 decent bike And I don't know if there's some way, how do we get that into, you just said the legislature?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I don't remember that coming up in like our initial, when we did the analysis, it was with Smart Growth America, and it was about 5 years ago about e-bike programs, but that's a great point of how are there ways that we can provide some incentives for those, just to be able to get the battery pack and transition them. So yeah, I'd love to get your information. Sure. Great. All right.
Great. Well, again,
thank you.
Kelly, thank you both very much.
Thank you.